Good morning. It's great to be with you on this Easter Sunday. And while we're not here together physically, we're here because of this great hope that we have in Jesus Christ. We're here to celebrate the story of Easter. And even though there are parts of this story that can really be difficult for us to handle, we know how the story ends. And because we know how the story ends, it brings us great hope. And I really want to share this message of hope with you this morning because I think for some, we are continue to, as we go through this time of just uncertainty, that we can lose our hope if we're not careful. And I want to remind you today that even when we can't make sense of what God is doing, that God is still at work, He's still in control. And because of that, we have His promises in His Word that He is with us, and that should give us hope. Of all days in the life of a believer, this day is a day of hope. I read this story this past week of a major in the Army who had been captured by the Viet Cong during Vietnam War. His name was Major Harold Kirshner. And Harold Kirshner, as he was captured, he got to meet a lot of other prisoners of war. And he met this one young Marine who had been a prisoner for a couple of years, and he seemed to be really doing well. He was strong, he was healthy, he was almost like a leader to the other prisoners of war. But he found out later that this young Marine had made a deal with the Viet Cong that if he had done everything that they asked him to do, that they would eventually release him. Well, after about a year of being this model prisoner, this young Marine realized that his captors had no intention of letting him go. Major Kirshner said it appeared at that point when he came to realize that he was not going to be released, that he lost all hope. He withdrew himself, he quit eating, he quit hanging out with the rest of the prisoners. All he wanted to do was be by himself. He even said that he almost became like a zombie. And within just a few weeks, this once young, strong, healthy Marine had passed away. How could that have happened? Well, it has been proven time after time when people lose hope, they lose their purpose. They feel like they have no reason to exist. I hope you're not feeling even close to that. I hope that your hope is in Jesus Christ is so strong that it gives you what you need to carry on day in and day out, even when we can't make sense of what is taking place in our world. But I wanted to tell you about this Easter story in a different way today. I want you to come to understand how desperation and how the agony of death was replaced with a great hope on that Sunday when Christ was resurrected. You see, in Matthew chapter 27, we read this incredible story of everything that took place in the life of Jesus and the life of those who were with Jesus. And we see that in chapter 27 of Matthew that as Jesus is before Pilate and as he goes through all these things and as we see that the soldiers mock Jesus, we see the crucifixion of Jesus, the disciples and all those who were following Christ at that time must have felt this great hopelessness, like everything that Jesus had told them now was through. And there was no reason to go on. And from that, I want you to understand that the sting of death that was experienced on that Friday can bring hopelessness. Whenever you go through a time when you can't make sense of something, or when you continue to ask and ask and ask and pray and pray and pray, and for whatever reason God chooses not to hear your prayer, there can almost be this hopelessness that you're now on your own, that you can't make it. And you lose the sense to fight and to move forward. It happens so many times in life that people give up hope, or people feel like they're in a hopeless situation. And I want to encourage you this morning, regardless of where you're at or what you may have faced in your life, there's no problem, there's no situation, there's nothing that you can face in life where it is hopeless, because we have the hope of Jesus Christ living in us. I think about this amazing story in chapter 27 of Matthew. And I think about for those 3 years how his disciples, those men who followed Christ, who gave up what they would normally be doing in order to follow him, of being able to witness and to be a part of so many great things, and how even though Jesus tried to warn them, they couldn't quite figure it out. And then at this moment, when all these things that even though Jesus told them began to happen, they begin to lose this hope. I think about how difficult it must have been as a follower of Christ to see what they were experiencing. There's something about death that seems so final. There's something about death that brings this heaviness to our heart. I've been there, you've been there. And you know that nothing seems as painful as death. Even when we're prepared. In fact, Billy Graham says this: no matter how prepared you think that you are for death of a loved one, it still comes with a shock and it still hurts very deeply. I think that moment when the disciples were watching and seeing what Jesus was going through, I think there was this heaviness in their heart. And I think as they saw him taken to the cross and placed up there, that we read in Matthew chapter 27, beginning at verse 32, that it tells us they came to a place called Golgotha. And there they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And sitting down, they kept watching over him there. And above his head, they placed a written charge against him: "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." We read about those two that were crucified with him, one who was his right and one on his left. and how the guards were yelling that you say you're going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God. It tells us in verse 41, in the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. And then later on in chapter 27, it tells us that from noon until 3, darkness came over all the land. And then we read where Christ calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Could you imagine what those people were experiencing at that time? How all hope felt like it was gone, that it was over. But here's the thing that we must realize, that even in those moments of hopelessness, our God is with us. Even when we can't make sense of things, God is there. So what we understand is that the sting of death that was experienced on that Friday can bring hopelessness. But we move to Saturday, and Scripture doesn't really say much about Saturday at all. But we come to understand that some things can happen when God is quiet. And that leads me to the second point, that the shocking silence that was experienced on that Saturday can cause us to question where our hope is. Whenever I've gone through a difficult period in my life, it seemed like the difficult period is always followed up by a moment where things are quiet, where you're silent, where you're trying to make sense of what happened. Like when you're going through an event, you kind of push through because that's what you have to do. But then when the crowds are gone, when you're by yourself, when you're in bed at night by yourself, you kind of start allowing your mind to wander and think about, God, where are you? Why do I feel so empty? Why do I feel so hurt? Why do I feel isolated? I think about, we know that in Scripture that disciples all ran off and hid and were afraid. And sometimes we might want to be critical of that, but think about that in your own life. How many times when you've gone through a really tough time that the thing that you want to do is just get away, isolate yourself. You want to try to make sense of stuff. Sometimes you want to, in the quietness of where you're at, you want to call out to God, waiting for God to answer you, but for whatever reason, sometimes He chooses not to. I think those who were following Christ may have been in that same situation. We know in Scripture that there are times when God is quiet. There's times when God allows us to have to work through and to wait on Him. We read about in Genesis chapter 17 of Abraham and Sarah after they were given this promise of having this child and having to wait. And even though it didn't make sense because they were so much older than what people were having babies at that time were, just didn't make sense. Where was God? Why was He allowing them to feel desperation? We can read in Job chapter 7 where Job had went through this very trying and difficult time and he's questioning God. He's calling out to God and for whatever reason God has chosen to remain quiet at this point. We think about in John chapter 11 when Mary and Martha had asked Jesus to come back to heal their brother who had been sick, and Jesus delayed being there. In fact, when Jesus finally came, Lazarus was already dead and placed in the tomb. And for those days when they were waiting, I wonder what they were thinking. I wonder how hard it was for them to take this. Or you can even see what we read about earlier, that when Jesus was on that cross and when he called out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? It wasn't that God had left Jesus. It was that moment, though, of desperation when things don't make sense. And I believe that silence on that Saturday caused many of them to question, where was their hope? You may be there right now. You had plans. You had things all mapped out. It looked like it was going to be a glorious season. And then all of a sudden you're hit with this virus. And things are canceled. Things are postponed. Life as we've known it is no longer the way it was. And so we begin to kind of question, God, where are you? And maybe in this period, God is remaining quiet because he's allowing us to evaluate our lives. He's allowing us to search our hearts. He's allowing us to focus on things that we probably should have been focusing on all the time. God is still with us. And that's what's so great about the Easter story. When all hope seemed to be lost, when there didn't seem to be a way, suddenly we come to this Sunday morning. And what a glorious Sunday morning it was. And we read in Matthew chapter 28 that it says, after the Sabbath at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. And there was a violent earthquake, from the angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. Oh, what a great story this is. But listen what it says here. The angel said to the woman, do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he has said. Come and see the place where he laid. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you. The shouts of he is alive on that was experienced on that Sunday revives our hope. It restores our sense of purpose. It gives us the reason to push forward. While one day, 2 day, 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, we question, we wonder, we ask why. And then suddenly God begins to reveal his big picture, his purpose, his plan in our lives, and suddenly things begin to make sense again. And that's exactly what these people had experienced. Even though they went to find Jesus, he wasn't there. And now they've been told that he is alive. And the story goes on, and it tells us that while they were on their way, other things happened. Some great things. And so the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them, greeting. He said, they came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and they will see him. He is alive. He is not dead. It is not finished. It is not over. It is not through. That is the message of hope that we have today, that regardless of what you're facing, what circumstance you might be in, it is not over. The love of God is in us. He cares for us. He cares about us more than anything else. And because of that, we have a hope that can carry us through and help us have not only this willingness to make it, but we can have joy in the process. I hope today that you will take a moment to give thanks to God for this great hope that we have, and to be able to experience this hope so that we can live this life. I am confident that when we return, we will be stronger. Our faith will be greater. Our joy will be more. Our peace will be solid. And our hope will be present. And it won't be because of what you and I have done, but it will be because we have learned to put our trust in the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ. May God be with you, and may your hope be full today as you worship him.